And we're live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire. I'm the event coordinator at Village Books in Bellingham, Washington and Linden, Washington, and I'm delighted to be hosting tonight's event. A few things before we get started. If you happen to be hearing an echo, first try turning down your computer a little bit, or make sure you only have one tab open, one window open in your browser. The third thing to try is put on some headphones. If one of those things doesn't work, I'm sorry. Good luck. So some features about Crowdcast. There is a green follow button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you click on that, then you can follow what we're doing at Village Books. We have lots of events coming down the road. We are not letting a little thing like a pandemic stop us. So we are continuing our robust event programming that we're known for. So. Thank you to any of you who contributed at registration for this event. While we are very happy to be able to offer these events for free, we do appreciate those of you who chose to kick in a couple of dollars at registration. That's very helpful to us during this time. If you didn't or couldn't, that's fine too. Like I said, we're happy that we can provide these events for free. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there's a chat. We are going to go ahead and disable that. Let me do that right now before I forget. We're going to disable the chat just for the duration of the conversation between the authors tonight. We're going to bring it back when it's time for the Q&A. So you will have your chance to say, well done, ask questions, and if a question occurs to you during the course of the event, you can still ask it. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see it says ask a question. If you click on ask a question, a little dialog box pops up and you can type your question in there, and we'll keep it there until the Q&A period. And you can do that at any time during the conversation. So if something occurs to you that you want to ask the authors, just pop it in, ask a question, and we'll get to it at the Q&A portion. I want to state that our virtual readings gallery is a safe space. Any user exhibiting offensive, hateful, or inappropriate behavior will be dismissed from the event immediately. Another important button on this particular screen is that one right there. It says purchase as the world burns here. If you click on that button, it takes you directly to the Village Books website where you can purchase copies of both authors' books that we have with us this evening. So we encourage you, if you're feeling inspired by what you hear tonight, we encourage you to click through to the Village Books website and purchase their books and support the authors and an independent bookstore. We would appreciate it. Okay, let's see. I think that's my housekeeping stuff. So about tonight's event, this is actually in our virtual Lit Live series. This is our first Nature of Writing series event that we have had virtually. Village Books is pleased to have a partnership with the North Cascades Institute, and all throughout the year, we have a series of events that we partner with them on. It. It's called their Nature of Writing series. So tonight is a Nature of Writing series event. So for those of you who are not familiar with the North Cascades Institute, it is a conservation organization focused on transformative learning experiences in nature, including place-based environmental education, outdoor recreation, health and wellness, conservation, environmental justice, and community engagement. Since 1986, they have helped connect people, nature, and community through science, art, literature, and the hands-on study of the natural and cultural history of the Pacific Northwest. I encourage you to take a look at their website at ncascades.org. The North Cascades Institute it's an incredible organization. The things that they do for our community and for Pacific Northwesterners and the ecosystem of the Pacific Northwest is really, they are tireless in what they do. So we're pleased that tonight's event is part of that series. Okay, and so now a little bit about our moderator this evening. Award-winning journalist Rebecca Clarren has been writing about the rural West for more than 20 years. Her journalism, for which she has won the Hillman Prize and Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship and 9 grants from the Fund for Investigative Journalism, has appeared in such publications as Mother Jones, High Country News, The Nation, and Salon.com. Her debut novel, Kickdown, that was put out by Skyhorse Press in 2018, was shortlisted for the Penn Bellwether Prize. So we are pleased to have Becca with us here tonight. And then our featured author, Lee Vandervoo, is an award-winning investigative and environmental journalist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Guardian, among many others. Her 2016 book, The Fish Market, which chronicles the gentrification of the sea in the name of sustainable seafood, won an Oregon Book Award for general nonfiction. So tonight, Lee is here to discuss her brand new book. This one right here, it's called As the World Burns, The New Generation of Activists and the Landmark Legal Fight Against Climate Change. So, to thunderous applause in your homes or wherever you happen to be watching this event, please join me in welcoming Lee Vandervoo and Rebecca Clarren.
Thank you.
Thank you. So nice to be here. Lee and I have known each other a very long time. We've actually shared an office together here in Portland, Oregon for years, and we don't tend to write things without letting each other have a first stab at them. So it is such a pleasure to be here to support this wonderful book that I have seen take root from when it was just a little idea into now to this fabulous piece of investigative and explanatory reporting. Lee and I talk a lot about ideas and writing and the limitations and opportunities that journalism can provide. And we also talk about why to write the books that we're writing. And there's this wonderful, the late Chuck Bowden, who writes beautifully about the environment and especially about the desert in the Southwest. One time I was such a fan and I badgered him, and we got to have wine one day in his office in his house. And I asked him, I was really scared about whether to write a book or not, and talking to him about it. And he said, "You're really overthinking this." He said, when an idea grabs you by the gut and it doesn't let go, that's when you know you have to write something about it. If you can stop thinking about an idea, you should definitely not write a book, because books break your heart. And in my experience, they also break your brain. And so I'm curious, Lee, if you could talk a little about why this book grabbed you by the gut and didn't let go. Why did you do this beautiful book that also broke your brain? I know it did. Why this one? Why now?
Well, since you heard me agonize through that process, you might know better than I do. But no, really, I was looking for a project, as you all know, and there are certain themes in my work that I really was looking for. I like to work outside. I want to work with interesting characters. I want to do stories about the environment. And things that are, I think, socially really important. And I was watching this case as like maybe I should be covering this. And I think in early days when Juliana versus the U.S. was just a kind of in the early parts of its process through the courts, right? It was 21 young people suing the federal government over climate change and basically charging that the United States government had violated their constitutional rights to life, to liberty and property by perpetuating a fossil fuel energy system through subsidies, through permits, through authorizing fossil fuel energy infrastructure, and that essentially was putting the children's lives at risk and perpetuating climate change. And I think a lot of folks in the media regarded it maybe as a publicity stunt. And I was watching it thinking, my God, is this for real? Like all these little kids like suing the government. And I kind of watched it move along, and right about this time I'm thinking, is this a project for me? I really couldn't contain my amazement that this thing was going to trial. And at the same time also had a lot of questions like, can an 11-year-old really articulate the case for the climate? And who are the adults in this situation? Are the kids really all in it? Or are they being stage managed by their parents? Like, what really is happening here? And so I started interviewing them, and I got a grant to do that, to interview the plaintiffs in the regions that they came from, around the country and talk to them about why climate change was important to them, and also understand a little bit about climate impacts where they lived, meet the parents, meet the attorneys, and just to get ready for covering their trial. And I started to do that work and met quite a few of them, and then moved to Springfield, Oregon to cover the trial, which was supposed to be October 29th, 2018. And the trial was canceled. And folks have followed the news, then you already know that there were a lot of attempts to stymie this case, but the last minute legal maneuvers in this trial were very, very unique, and they underscore kind of the Trump administration's efforts to undermine the courts, really, or to use the courts as an extension of the executive branch and kind of like pushing powers ahead. And watching that happen with 21 really young people in the mix in this incredibly important question, it was really kind of, I mean, it was super depressing, honestly, like to be in the woods with this, hefty cat named Larry, who I was like pet sitting, and like all these mean raccoons, and like be digesting, like, this is how the US government is responding to this really urgent question about children and their environment. And very shortly after the 2018 IPCC report came out, basically.
You want to explain what IPCC is, just for people who don't know?
This is the UN's kind of committee on climate science, if you will. It's scientists from all over the world essentially agree. It's like on consensus science about how bad is it. And they're unlike engineers in that when engineers build a bridge, their sense of risk is like, we're going to plan for the worst case scenario. This is almost like best case scenario planning, because you have to have hundreds of people sort of agree. So it's like, this is the baseline for what people will agree on. And they came back in November 2018, like right after this trial cancellation, and said, we have 12 years to fix this before we're in planetary breakdown, essentially. And so, I was still in touch with all the plaintiffs, and we started living this year, right, where it became clear that they weren't going to go to trial, at least not right away, that the science was worse than any of us imagined. The political landscape was insane, and this was, if we all remember the general election 2 years ago, this incredible fight for congressional power with a president who wouldn't acknowledge that any of these things were true, and then started to experience the worst year of natural disasters that our nation has ever seen. So all of those things compelled me to just keep writing, whether the trial was going to go forward or not. And I ended up sticking with the plaintiffs, following them for about a year, and that became this book.
And you visited them in their homes and where they live, and saw the impacts of the climate firsthand. Before we turn to speaking about these really fascinating and incredible people that you've spent all this time with, I wondered if you could just give us an update, not to scoop the book, but just to give us an update about where the case is now. They didn't dismiss the case, right?
Well, it's pending on appeal. So it was technically dismissed from the District Court of Oregon, went to the Ninth Circuit to hear an appeal and ask the question whether it could go back to trial. A three-judge panel said no, and so now they're appealing to the full Ninth Circuit to ask the question again. So, it either is going to go back to the lower court through that process, or the question is, will it go to the Supreme Court?
Okay, and who will sit on that court?
Yeah.
I don't have a fly on my head, do I?
I
had to get it. Make sure, tell me if I do. So without further ado, I wonder if you could read to us a little from your book, and take us into the lives of one of these young people who are one of the plaintiffs, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure, of course. So this is Jaden Foytlin, and Jaden, at the time when I met her, was 15 years old. She was living in South Louisiana, and really, I would describe her as the toughest of this bunch. living in South Louisiana and being a plaintiff in a federal lawsuit about climate change is a heck of a social stigma. And Jaden has really been just incredibly resilient and brave. And so this is a piece of her story. Um, in the morning, I'd first encountered Jaden in her bedroom, purple, after I found my way down a dark hall of her pink house. Jaden's older sister, Erin, a few minutes awake, was flopped on the bed under a pastel comforter, and Jaden was at her desk, the wall above it covered in watercolors and drawings. Jaden was friendly and talked about her activism and her art and her love for aeronautics, told me how captivated she is by planets and how she hopes to one day study science. She said the planets that used to adorn her room were still put away. The reference was to the flooding that figured large in her pleadings. So I asked Jaden to tell me about the floods, especially the flood in 2016, and her expression darkened. Here's what she said. I woke up at like 3, somewhere in the AM, because my older sisters, Erin and Grace, were knocking on my door telling me to wake up, and that water was coming through the house. Of course, I thought I was dreaming because I was like, why the hell would water be coming through? I was kind of thinking, what do they want? I thought they were just trying to make me come out of my bed with some excuse or something. They weren't. Jaden sat up. She swung her legs to the floor and stepped into water up to her ankles. The house was a ranch on a slab, an L-shaped building where the longest length reaching deep into the backyard. Jaden was at the end of this stretch in a room with a door to the yard, and outside it was raining hard. She walked toward her sister's voices in the hallway, opened the door to find them there, and as she did this, pulled the door toward her. Water rushed from her room into the rest of her home. I was like, oh, that's my fault. Oh my God, why did I open the door? She said. Elsewhere, water had been rising through the cracks in the foundation, soaking the carpeting. Sewage and old water rose in the toilets and in the bathtubs. But until then, most of it was in Jaden's bedroom with Jaden, slowly leaking in from under the door. The sewage had the worst smell in the world. It was so nasty, she said. My family ended up getting sick. A lot of my neighbors ended up getting sick. Jaden's brother Dylan, her sister Grace, and Grace's boyfriend went to the police station, but no one could help much, just gave them a few sandbags to block the doors while the water rose. It wasn't enough. So next they used all the blankets, then the towels. So much water, they were no match for it. They gave up and focused on the electronics, on unplugging everything, worried about electrocution, and trying to save what could be saved. Drawings and photos were lost anyway. Jaden's bed frame dissolved in the lake of her room. Her brother's toys were next. When I asked how high the water rose, she pointed to a watermark on the wall about 2 feet above the floor. I hate that flood so much, she said. Lots of people don't know about this particular storm, but it actually is considered, a major natural disaster. It was a torrential downpour in Louisiana. It was the nation's worst natural disaster since Sandy, and it dumped more than 7 trillion gallons of water. And just perspective on how much that is, it's 3 times the amount of rain that fell during Katrina. So it's a very major event that we often don't hear about, but Jaden's experienced that kind of torrential rain for years.
And that's different than it used to be. That's been linked to climate change.
Yeah, increasing intensity in rainfall during severe storms is part of climate effects.
Wow. I mean, it's rare, it seems to me, to tell this kind of sweeping issue, to talk about any kind of sweeping issue, environmental or otherwise, from the perspective of kids. And I wonder, obviously, the lawsuit brought that about, but no one else had really chosen to write this story, to write this book at all, focusing on these people's lives and these children's lives. And I wonder if you might just talk about why you chose to do that this way. The book, for those of you who haven't read it yet, it goes back and forth between the stories of these different kids' lives and also the story of the trial and the political machinations and sort of the history of the politics behind climate change. It's really fascinating. But yeah, I wonder if you might just speak a little to why this lens on this book and why that was important to you to tell it this way, to talk about climate change from this perspective.
Well, it was very different, right? Like, we're both environmental reporters, so we know how these stories go. It's like usually there's, you describe the landscape of the problem, and then there's some sort of political argument about what to do about it. In the case of climate change, that argument has really reduced, often tries to sideline the science and insert disinformation and kind of reduce the scale of urgency. Um, and I think, like, after so many years of hearing it, you become sort of immune. I hadn't really covered a ton of climate science before this. I was always more focused on toxics. Um, so there was a lot for me to learn in reporting this, and to be learning it through the perspective of young people was an incredibly different vantage point. It was something that like. I feel like it's a conversation I haven't heard before. Like, how young people are talking about climate change is very, very different from how I was talking about it with my same age peers and family. And I just really wanted to bring that lens to their view.
Yeah, I love it. It's like a window that we don't read about enough, and we don't see enough. And maybe us middle-aged, I'm sure youth activists, anyone on this call who's a youth activist is probably following this and knows far more about it, but it was very eye-opening to me. I wanted to shift gears just a little bit. Lee has written, for those of you who don't know, her book, The Fish Market, is a fascinating book about the privatization of fishing. She's been reporting on other issues throughout this time. She has a big, amazing investigative piece that came out last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago, with ProPublica about an energy project. It's not oil, an energy project in Oregon. But I guess I wonder, when you and I have talked about the through line in your work, I've always been really loved the way you talk about, like, I'm not interested in landscapes as an environmental reporter. I'm interested in the people. These aren't exactly environmental stories. These are stories, you've often said to me, about class and who wins and who loses. And it's often environmental issues, very stark in those cases. And I wondered if you could explain to us how As the World Burns fits into that general lens of storytelling that you have done for more than 20 years.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, as you've heard me say, all environmental stories, I love them because they are about beautiful places, and they often involve really committed, strong characters, and I really like that, and I like to be outside. But the thing that does drive me is that they are almost all the time boiled down to who benefits and who pays. And there are really important social questions there. In the case of the Juliana youth, what's been so fascinating, actually about all youth and climate changes, is the approach that the government has taken and kind of defending against this case has been about the overreach of judicial power. I mean, really, I think there's just a lot of attempt to delay this. Like, the longer it's delayed, the more we never have to hear about it in court. The more we don't have to deal with it, and the longer the fossil fuel industry gets to make profits. But and really, that's who benefits, right? But they have their man, working for the Department of Justice. Jeffrey Bossert Clark I've reported, is a former claims litigator for BP, and spent a lot of his early career settling claims over the BP oil spill. So, you can imagine that if that's the person that the Trump administration is putting in charge of settling environmental claims, how those are going to go. But the conversation has always been, this is a judicial overreach. The judicial branch can't tell the executive branch what to do about climate change. If people don't like what the executive branch is doing about climate change, they can do one of two things. They can change the executive, i.e. vote, or they can lobby Congress or change their congressional leaders, i.e. vote. Nobody under 18 has those options. So for me, this does distinguish young people as a special class of American citizens who are getting, frankly, really hosed on this whole thing. They have no remedy. And the fact that, the court hasn't stepped in yet only really magnifies that.
Well, and as you'll see when you read this book, Lee traveled. There are several plaintiffs who are from near where we live in Oregon, but Lee traveled far and beyond into places that most reporters don't go to visit, and that aren't on the front pages, places that aren't often on the front pages of our news. And I wondered if you would read to us from one of these communities from, I believe it's a young woman on the Navajo reservation that you're going to read to us from, about what she's encountering in her life, and what she sees that's changing to her community and to her culture in a way that she's losing. Her community is feeling like they're losing because of climate change.
Sure. I mean, so this is Jamie Butler. She's a citizen of the Navajo Nation. Growing up here, Jamie learned about climate change when she was 9. When she joined Juliana of the United States at 14, she did it for the animals because she worried about what climate change would do to them. But Jamie worries more today about what climate change will do to her and to other Navajo people like her. Sometimes these concerns about harms to the animals and harms to the Dene are more or less the same concerns. The summer of 2013 underscores what she means. That year, the drought lasted into what used to be the rainy season, and the wild horses that roamed free, many were dying of thirst. There were reports of horses with ribs sticking out, horses found dead at dried up watering holes, and horses who tried to kick their way into watering tanks for a drink. The horses were a new kind of problem, generally. The land was already overtaxed by drought, and the horse population was meanwhile growing larger all the time. The Navajo had lived peacefully with feral horses for decades, but with the drought, they had to confront the reality of the land not being able to support the horses, along with all the rest. The Dene were having cultural clashes over what should be done, whether the horses ought to be rounded up and adopted off the reservation or sold. Such talk collided with traditional values, like the value to just let the horses be. But no matter their feelings, people cared about the horses and did not want to see them suffer. That summer, the drought in the central part of the reservation was especially unyielding. In one report, the Navajo Times relayed the tale of a herd fighting for a wet patch of mud where a faucet had dripped. Their bodies queued up so thick it was impossible to tell until after they were loaded into trailers, too tired and malnourished to fight, what the commotion was even about. Only after they were cleared away did the tiny spot of wet ground show. A few years later, in the spring of 2018 brought drought so severe that Jamie remembers it more starkly than most. The winter was drier than ever before, the spring runoff sparse, and there was no snowpack to feed the watering holes where the horses and livestock went to drink when the rivers ran dry. In one part near Cameron, there's like this little flat part that absorbs a ton of water, Jamie says. She's talking about a stock pond where animals have long come for water in the worst of times. The water brackish and left to the wild. That year it was a sliver of itself, and what water was there was being swallowed slowly by the dusty soil underneath. The sparse water on dry soil, the two mixed like porridge, not something you could drink. It just became quicksand. Right in the middle of it there was just a small pond and little puddle basically, and because there was no other water in the area, all the wild horses around there came and tried to get the water. More than 110 horses died in the mud, maybe more than could be safely counted after others slipped deep underground. Their bodies were found in a ring around the puddle, their coats caked in hardened earth from struggling for anything to drink. The ground around this muddy circle was dusty, held the bones of dead horses past, and later it was encircled in barbed wire so officials could move on to what came next, excavating bodies to deter scavenging birds and dogs, avoid disease, and clear out the smell. It's just kind of rough seeing things go down that we have no control over. It affects everyone, Jamie says. For the rest of the summer, people hauled water for themselves and for the horses too. Rescue organizations sent hay in plastic tubs to make safe troughs. In another year of ceaseless drought, filling the tubs would become a new kind of normal. These conditions horrified Jamie. and she worries most for older members of her community, like her grandmother. It's just really strenuous on the elders, who are the main people who still have our culture, Jamie says. She explains how many still live alone in the traditional earthen homes, tending their flocks of sheep and horses in the vast empty parts of the desert. They haul their own water, gather their own plants, some farm their own food. They face a tougher job as water gets scarcer. Advancing age already makes life difficult for Jamie's grandma Eleanor, older than 80 and living alone with sheep and a couple of horses. Jamie says her grandmother sometimes spends hours driving for water. She used to just drive into Cameron, but since there isn't enough water in Cameron for everyone, the wells run dry and she has to go to the city, another half an hour away, or another hour to Flagstaff, sometimes even farther to Luke. Because the elders are the keepers of the old ways, the water gone out of the land can spell the tradition gone out of it too. If the elders are no longer able to live a traditional life, there is less a way for the younger generations to learn.
Talk about grabbing you in the gut. That is so beautiful. Thank you for reading that. I have thought about that passage. It has stuck with me, unfortunately. And I think it's interesting that writing is so beautiful and so evocative and sad. And environmental stories, environmental journalists, we aren't always the best time at a party. We have bad reputations as being very depressing and our stories being very depressing. And yet what surprised me about your book is there was a surprisingly hopeful element. And I don't mean to say that climate change isn't something very serious and that your book isn't very serious about the risks and the threat, but there is this feeling I got from reading it that I felt hopeful. And I wondered, I know there's a lot of people with us tonight, even though we can't see your faces, that are environmental activists and care a lot about the environment. Maybe some of you are even young and youthful and or feel youthful if you're not young. And I wondered, this is sort of a two-part question. I wondered if you could, one, talk about the layer in your book that I think is the hopeful part, is that there are these young people who are leading us towards a different future, ideally. And if you feel like there are lessons that you've learned from the plaintiffs themselves that could inspire the rest of us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that layer is definitely there. These young people are so committed, and that it does give you hope. And also, young people are hopeful. They don't hopefully look at life like it's all a lost cause, right? Sometimes you have this conversation with older people, and it's a lot of gloom and doom and frustration. And what I thought was so interesting, in part talking to one of the plaintiffs, Scott Martinez, was just the analysis that he had about the climate story, the climate crisis, and how the story gets told when you leave young people out, told, is just like he's been on stage talking about climate since he was like 6 years old. He's very active. The kid grew up basically as a media savant. He's 19 now. He might have just recently turned 20. But he is probably more qualified to talk about media than a lot of people on the other side of the notebook, right? And one of the things he said is, we can't afford to be that dire. And if you listen to young people, you hear the conversation about solutions and about optimism and what we can do, as opposed to when you're talking to people in governments who don't want to do anything, or when you're talking to older adults who are incredibly frustrated. And I think he's very right about that. So that was my experience with the plaintiffs, and I hope a lot of that is really in these pages. And as far as what older adults can do, it's kind of like anything that you can do, right? And everybody shows up in different ways. But the one thing that I will say was kind of uniform among the plaintiffs and their feelings about this issue was that a lot of them had frustration with people saying, "You're our last hope. Thank God for you, because you're our last hope." And sometimes that really hit them like an abdication of responsibility on the part of older people, like, "Oh, okay, well, you're here. I don't need to do anything." And really, I think just seeing older people be active and engaged is meaningful, and it's kind of one of these things where everybody has to do their part, and maybe that looks a little different for everyone.
Kieran, one of the plaintiffs, and you did a reading last week that I got to attend from your backyard, watching you through the window while you recorded it. And Kieran was saying they had some wonderful advice about how to make sure you're doing something creative to keep going with this work. Find a way to not make to find different ways to fight. Try all the options in front of you, even if you can't vote, that there are things you can do for sure to be engaged. And I wondered if you wanted to read, just as our final reading for the night, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. If you wanted to read a little from the section about Kieran and the choices they're making that are such an inspiration.
I mean, Kieran's great because, as they said in that reading, Kieran has found creative outlets, really a place to regenerate and to rest from being in the movement and to not be consumed by it. And so it was a joy really to be able to follow Kieran a little bit through that world and understand it more. I think it is one of the more hopeful communities in the story. So it's sort of a kick to read this. It's Christmas break and everyone is tired of everything, including the town they live in. So Kieran's band goes on tour with a group of others. The band is called geophagia, which is the medical term for people who eat dirt. They stop in Portland on a blustery night when the rain is coming down sideways and play late at the Twilight Cafe, about the only place of its size that still is a decent stage and hasn't been turned into apartments yet. The cafe is in a part of town that would probably never turn up in a Portlandia episode. It's in the section of southeast Portland between the Nouveau Riche High Tower, ever encroaching from the west, and the area to the east that seems an homage to the car culture of old. Cinder block buildings smattered along a defunct highway, the too many lanes of pedestrian terror, lined with Burger Kings and Taco Bells and other places with parking lots. Inside, the Twilight is a place of hardiness and endurance, of tall boys and appendicitis, face tattoos and banjos. It is red and black painted with black upholstery, a black painted bar and stools. Behind the bar is a collection of televisions. One of them is playing a weird movie, another an underwater documentary, sports on a third, and the fourth broadcasts what is happening on the stage to the bar patrons marooned on the wrong side of a wall in between. The place is shaped like an L and it is packed. People with short bangs, denim jackets, knit caps and beards, fuzzy scarves. Almost everyone is wearing some shade of black plus patches, spikes, sometimes chains. A guy with a green knit bandana sticks out adorably like a deer in a hunting vest. Somehow everyone is both impressively young and impressively youthful, and the show encapsulates everything young people ought to be worried about. Kieran is on stage when I arrive, Act 3 of 6, playing the mandolin and singing while their partner plays drums and black lipstick. A singer in a leather skirt alternates between an accordion and a melodica. There's a stand-up bass, a guitar, a violin, and everybody is wearing a dark-colored t-shirt. Behind them, the mural on the wall is a simple black and white spiral, one that looks not like the 2D paint that it is, but like a tube that falls endlessly inward, like it might swallow the band and concert-goers along with it. The concrete floor in front of the stage is full of people, so many they are spilling into the handful of booths at the bend in the L, and the sound booth, which is tucked into a corner not far from the stage, is dangerously mobbed with dancers. Above my head, Kieran's image is being miniaturized in a cell phone while it records, the backdrop spiral, a halo recast in purple stage light. They're singing to a tune that moves between an accordion waltz and a string riff, with a soaring violin that will soon end in screaming. We are nonsensical, mindless, identical, the way things are going, soon all will be lost. I don't need to be hopeful for the future, standing here watching all this refuse floating by. Kieran has just returned from Switzerland, where they met with the ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church and spoke at the World Council of Churches in Geneva. These are the kinds of things Kieran is invited to do because of the lawsuit. There's a photo of this meeting on Facebook. Kieran in a gray suit add attention to the robed high priest, the Pope of the East, Kieran calls him. Right now, this recent meeting seems supremely ironic, since Kieran is looking quite secular, hedonistic even, in more usual clothes, a studded black denim jacket with a subhumans patch on the back, black jeans, and the long belt with a chain. The United Church of Christ, UCC, for which Kieran was an emissary abroad, has long embraced this dual ethos. Kieran's mother used to be a minister in the church in Eugene, where the UCC teaches that Earth is a God-given home, a thing to love and to steward. That the church embraces this idea helps explain how Kieran's deep commitment to the environment was fomented young. Kieran thinks not enough people know about the UCC, and in another conversation told me, basically everyone thinks is bad about American churches. They're doing the opposite. Non-practicing though Kieran is, the UCC is still a touchstone. Good people who do good work, if not in the grassroots way that Kieran most relates to, the way that is all around us tonight, this scene at the twilight, another kind of religion. And later, Kieran talks to me a little about how they think that maybe winning the culture war is such a major part of Juliana and of the climate fight, maybe more so than winning the case. And I think those kinds of ideas, there's a place for us, and we're going to express this through whatever channel we have, and so what if deniers have the presidency right now? We have Vanity Fair. It's such an interesting idea and a source of strength, and I think that really comes through these folks so well.
Thank you for reading that. I know that some of you have questions, and we want to make sure that we have time for those. So I think this is the part where that can happen. Thanks.
Thank you.
And this is the part where I magically appear again so that we can take those questions. I'm going to re-enable the chat so that folks can either pop their questions in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, or you can just type them right into the chat on the side of the screen. Boy, that was fascinating. All of it, just hearing about the strength of the young people, but then also hearing the specific examples, like the story of the horses. I had heard a little bit about the horses, but hearing the description, the details, and imagining young people living with this just every day. This is their lives, and I'm particularly infuriated by the adults who do look at young people and say, "You are our hope. You're our only hope." It's because I can see how that does seem like a cop-out on the grown-ups' part, but also what a thing to put on the shoulders. What a burden to place. Oh, it's all up to you now. I was glad that you mentioned that, because that is something that upsets me greatly when I hear people say to young people, because I think, why would you say that to them? Why would you put that on them like that? But thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, I think young people are already carrying a lot. I wrote a column this week, and I did a little bit of research, and I realized, like, if you're 15 years old right now, you've lived through 9 of 10 of the hottest years on record. And if you're 22, you've seen all 10. If you look at NOAA science, there's the last decade or so, in particular since 2013, are considered the absolute worst years for natural disaster in America. So consider, if you're 7 years old, the perspective that you have is that the natural world is on some unending cyclical violent bender, right? And that disaster is coming at us all the time. That's a rough perspective, and I think that people don't always realize that young people living through that, they're already carrying that, right? They don't have to carry the work to fix it too.
Hmm.
Yep. But so you still keep up with all of these young people because you're so involved in the but what's happening now? Like you know how they're all doing?
Somewhat, yeah. I mean, I would say that I developed, more relationships with some plaintiffs than with others. It's
Okay.
a large group of people, and so 21 was a lot to focus on. And I think like some of them just they kind of self-select what work they're going to do in the case, and some of them are not that media interested, which is fine by me. It's up to them, if they want to have a relationship with me. So um, some were more game than others. And interestingly, I think Jamie Butler gave me one of the only interviews that she tends to give in this kind of depth. And so I'm like so grateful to her for doing that. But I haven't kept up with her maybe in the same way, just because like it's not her role. So I think I have a general sense of what folks are up to, and there are plaintiffs that I am in more frequent contact with. But of course, I want to follow their case and see what happens next, and plan to do more reporting.
If there's not a question from the audience at this point, I of course have more. Um, should I go ahead and ask one, Claire?
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
please. Yes.
I guess I wondered, Lee, I, as a writer, always love to know what other writers' writing process is. And so if there are writers in the audience, in case you are writers, I would love to know that for you, how you do this, what your process is, and if you have advice for young writers or old writers, I would love to hear that too.
Maybe I'll do the advice first. I mean, you just can never let anyone else tell you what your writing is. And, I think that's a strange thing to say because writing education maybe is so structured around feedback and peer review. And I feel like it's helpful to the point where a comment really resonates with you. When someone says something about your work and you're like, oh yeah, I know it, that that's the thing you take away, right? But I found some of these environments when I was younger to be maybe they pushed my writing in a direction where it didn't need to go at times because I think I want to do it right. I just want someone how to tell me how to do it right. Mm-hmm. And there's really the way you do it is the way you do it, and you can know that. So maybe just always stick with what rings true for you, what feels correct in your work, and maybe seek out that feedback just to for those things that might really hit you in the same way. But everything else is just cutting room floor. You just got to leave it. It's not valuable. It's white noise. As far as my process, one of the things I learned when writing The Fish Market, I had a lot of time in between. The Fish Market was written over a long period of time. I was also, as you know, an Alicia Patterson fellow, so I had a year where I was just reporting on seafood economics in coastal America, and I traveled quite a bit to do that work. And so there'd often be like a plane or a train in between my visiting a community or going out on a boat with someone or just going to the fish market and visiting with chefs and talking about seafood. And so I would sometimes in that downtime just write out my impressions, like really quick impressions, just what was fresh in my mind from that interview, visit, tour, whatever we were doing, as opposed to going to my notes and doing a lot of transcription and then putting together the final form, whatever it would be. And that's how I had done a lot of my articles. And I found in writing The Fish Market that those impressions that I would just write, sort of free write after the experience of diving into whatever I was into, were the things that made so much of the spine of the book. It was really this more like gut reaction and, things that were written from the heart in the moment that I realized when you go back later to try to put the writing together, if you're working from notes, if you're working from transcripts, you never get that back, right? You never get that moment where a thing has first impacted you. So when I set out in this project, I made that a practice where when I met a plaintiff, I would always take like a few hours right after that meeting, sometimes the next day, and just free write whatever came out, whatever I could remember. There's often a lot of detail that you can't record that will make its way in there. And I got injured, as you know, after I signed the contract for this book, and wasn't able to use a chair for the whole time that I was writing it. It was very odd for
Poor Lee, she was so tough. I would come into our office back when we could have an office together, and she would be writing standing up, or she would sit on like lie on this like tiny couch we used to have in there and be writing.
Yeah. For the first 2 chapters of the book, the entire thing was written standing up or lying on my back, which is just kind of not how I normally do things. But I also weave, right? And so I have this meditative thing that I do to kind of just like scrub my brain, which is weaving, and I do it standing up, and I don't even think about I'm standing. So I did a lot of weaving while I was writing this book, and I would just listen to my interviews from the plaintiffs while I was doing that, and some of them are, they're hours long, and I would just listen to them over and over. Sometimes I'd walk, and have a computer nearby and just write out in the same way anything that I might have missed. I went through that process maybe like two to 3 times with each of the plaintiffs who are in the book. So I kind of captured, I think, more of the heart of the interviews and the feeling of them than I did on the first pass. And that was really like, it was nice and it was interesting in that, I could do this sort of soothing standing thing and not necessarily be thinking about the work when I was in front of the computer, which is one of the harder tasks for me during that time. And, I'll probably keep doing it this way.
It's awesome. So there's a tiny silver lining in there. Yeah.
Can I ask you really quick? What was the age of like the youngest plaintiff?
When I started, Levi Draheim was 11. He was 8 when the lawsuit was filed, so it was already 3 years in the courts before I met him.
Wow.
I know this event is co-hosted by the North Cascades Institute, which is this amazing outdoor educational center in the Northwest, in the North Cascades National Park. And I just wondered, I'm putting you a little on the spot here, but I wondered if you wanted to talk about any of the climate impacts that you are reporting on in this book that relate to our beautiful North Cascades that we love so much. Are there examples from our region here?
Well, I would say so, yeah. I report quite a bit on fire. And 2 of the Juliana plaintiffs joined the lawsuit specifically because of the threat that fire posed to their family farm. They're from Southern Oregon, but that necessitated a lot of research about fire in the Pacific Northwest and then also Colorado, where Nick Venner is a plaintiff. And at the time that I met Nick, Colorado was having its worst fire season in history, and he has asthma, so he was not able to go outside. So I did a lot of, or not strenuously outside, we could sit in the yard. So I did a lot of reporting on pine beetle infestations, which are a huge, huge problem in the Rockies, but also an issue here, and how that makes those forests more vulnerable to fire. And I would say, fire is probably, at least this summer, seems like the most pressing concern that we have in the Pacific Northwest is the damage that'll be doing to our forests.
Yeah. It's heartbreaking. Yeah. It is.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. This was really eye-opening and interesting and thought-provoking for sure. So, and I want to thank the North Cascades Institute for being our partner on this Nature of Writing series event. We, as I said at the beginning, we cherish our relationship with the North Cascades Institute because it's a great organization. So I encourage you to go to ncascades.org if you are not familiar with them and check out the programs and things that they offer. So also, I encourage folks to click that green button on the center bottom of the screen that says "Purchase as the World Burns" here. There it is. Well, I don't know if Lee's in the middle on everybody else's screen, but we could like be bookend. She's in the middle on my screen.
She's in the middle on mine too.
So, and then we also have Rebecca's book listed on our website on that same page too. So, I encourage, and if you happen to be watching this recorded on YouTube, if you look down in the description, you'll see the link to our website, to that page that has their books listed. So, gosh, I think unless do either of you have any final words?
Go buy this book. It's awesome. You won't regret it. It's a great read and an important read. I think it's very important now, and it will last, but someone said something nice.
Thanks, Vic.
All right. Well, and Allie says thank you. Yes, and thank you to the audience. Thank you for everybody who turned up tonight. We appreciate it. And I think we will say good night.
Good night.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.